Hey guys, welcome to tonight's show. We're going to be joined by Kevin Cole of Unexpected Points to talk about the pros and cons and benefits of this Buffalo Bills offseason. But first, our guys with Handsome Jack.
Broadcasting live to Bills Mafia worldwide with Greg Tompsett and Aaron Quinn.
Welcome to the NFL. Doesn't matter what's happened before today. Today's a brand new day. It's a brand new season.
Your number one podcast for objective Buffalo Bills coverage. No matter where you are, we got you covered.
Good evening and welcome to the Cover One Buffalo podcast. You are joining your host, Greg Tompsett, along with my partner in crime, Aaron Quinn. Aaron, how we doing?
I'm doing pretty great, actually, Greg. I didn't tell you this when we were offline. I had maybe my most productive day as an adult ever. I did all of the linens and sheets and laundry in my house, and I started the day doing that, and I finished by putting them all on the bed and getting all the laundry put away in a single day. It's maybe never happened before. Definitely never happened before. It may never happen again in my life. I honestly, this is like the folklore of stay-at-home parenting, that I was able to do this and keep my kid alive. So I'm patting myself on the back tonight. I'm proud of myself as a productive adult for once.
Pretty big little Saturday. Might go to Bed Bath & Beyond, Home Depot. Don't know if we'll have time.
I don't know. It was a good productive day. Got a lot of podcasts in. Got a lot of Eric and Anthony in my ear while I was doing it. So I encourage anyone, if they need a productive boost, to head over to Cover One, and we've got you covered with some good Bills talk.
Yeah, a lot of good stuff on, the usage for Dalton Kincaid. And I know a lot of Bills fans listening right now probably listen to the Embedded series, which launched tonight at 7. I love seeing those behind the scenes with, where they were going. And there's always lip service about different, here's the top guy on our board. They had some pretty convincing clips there of, very early in the night where Terry Pagula is asking Bean about like, hey, who's the guy we're looking for? It's like, if we see that Utah tight end slide. And he's saying that was like at 7:00 before the draft had started. And then talking as the evening goes, like how much they were targeting him. And then that line from, Dennis Locke about he had, by their metrics, the way that they measure, catch radius and their internal like proprietary stuff on what they consider catchable and non-catchable, said he had the best hands measurable in their analytics view in the past 8 drafts, which crazy. The proof will be in the pudding of whether that turns out to be the case or not. But like that was somebody who is like their profession, the lead for their analytics department, saying that that was some interesting information.
Yes, and I'm sure there's going to be some people in the Bills mentions that will say this was all recorded after the fact. It's a conspiracy. They put this all together. No, I do think everything lines up. I've said it on every show since the draft that I know I'm called a homer all the time, Greg. I get it. I see it in the mentions, but I feel like one saying this because every year we talk about the limited number of round one actual players that you have graded for yourself. And then we know the Bills are always picking beyond that value for most drafts. And so to then say, well, then the one that was there slipped through and fell to you, it just feels so homery, but man, all the evidence sort of points to that actually being the case this year. So good for the Bills, but we'll find out tonight how much that was actually the case.
Yeah. We'll go through and view that. And to help us go through that discussion, we're welcoming on our special guest for the evening of Unexpected Points, Kevin Cole. Kevin, welcome. How we doing?
I'm doing well. Appreciate you having me on here. It's always good to try to digest everything that's gone on during the draft and have some more research coming out this week. But it really is, it's a little bit of a struggle during the summer. So I'm going to kind of switch to more of the fantasy, maybe some betting content out there for people who are interested in that during the off season. But the good thing about the NFL is it's basically a 12-month a year type of adventure that we're all going through.
No, we appreciate it. And I am excited to have you on tonight. Not only am I a fan, I'm also a member, a big fan of your Substack on Unexpected Points. You guys can find that in the show description here and some of the tweets we're going to be sending out tonight. But why don't you let the folks know a little bit? You had worked through some of the different bigger media companies in the industry that people have heard of, places like PFF, and then branching out on your own. Maybe talk a little bit about what your goal is at Unexpected Points, and taking, what drew me is, I'm a financial nerd and do a lot of our, salary cap analysis and going through the stuff in the CBA. I was drawn to the way that you take kind of a financial lens to the value of what it can provide for teams. So talk about what brought you that direction and what you're trying to accomplish with Unexpected Points.
Yeah, I mean, I do tend to look at things in a quantifiable sort of manner. So when it comes to the draft, a lot of the draft research that's been done, and this is stuff that goes back a couple of decades. Probably the seminal research was done by a couple of professors, Cade Massey and Richard Thaler, where they came up with this concept of surplus value. So it is a financial way of looking at the benefit that you get from a player versus what you would have to pay them on the free market. But I think generally what I try to do is, whether it's the financially explicitly in surplus value, whether it's looking at like points added for different types of players or points added on the field, because we're able to look at different plays and try to figure out how many points are being added based upon your expectations, different places. It's just try to have an explicit measure of value, try to be fairly explicit about what the methodology is. And, then we can talk. Then we can talk about where we may have gone wrong into certain things. What things are we ignoring that maybe we shouldn't ignore? Have it all explicitly come together into one particular value metric that people can look at, as opposed to saying, these are my top five quarterbacks because this guy does this and this guy does this and this guy does this. But then it's really hard to figure out how we're supposed to be able to sort together all this information, because it is extremely complicated. So it's trying to have a way of at least being explicit about what our assumptions are and what our values are on different things.
In that, does the rise of, and maybe I'm not fully understand, but does the rise of hybrid type players across every position group make pinning valuations more and more difficult for people doing data? Or like, how does that separation, like between cornerbacks and the roles and the types of cornerback play that there is, or even the conversation that Bills Mafia is having between what Dalton Kincaid's going to be asked to do as a tight end versus what they're going to have Dawson Knox do? Like, how do you determine the values within the position groups when there's hybrid players kind of floating out there that are high-end players?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. And I think that one of the reasons football is difficult, the main reason, is because of all the different interactions for all the different players. And I think that's obvious versus something like baseball, where most of it is really just a 1v1 type of interaction of pitcher versus hitter. And then the fielders, you can try to isolate some of that stuff with charting and whatnot. So that makes it difficult. It's also difficult with football that we just don't have a ton of data to go on. So if I'm going to say, let's try to have insights on what's going on today from historical data, like you said, how many type of tight ends did we have 15, 20 years ago who were not playing in line at all versus what we kind of have today, where there really are like glorified big slot receivers a lot of the time. So it makes it more difficult. But what I think we want to do is, and this is kind of the general philosophy when it comes to modeling and things like that, is it's trying to formalize what would be intuition based upon historical data. And it's not correct, right? So it's like all these models, none of them are right. None of the numbers that I have are perfectly valuing anyone or anything like that. But it's a question is whether or not it's useful. So you could say, a tight end like Kincaid, here's what we've seen from tight ends in the past. And knowing what knowing our expertise for how you may view them differently, then you could say, well, maybe we should tweak it off of that, what we know. But at least we have a baseline to go off of what we've seen in the past. And that's what we find is the best way to make predictions, is to say, what is the baseline from what we've seen in the past? Because if we're too specific and subjective on one particular instance, people tend to overvalue the particular or overvalue their expertise in there. So we want to say, let's have a baseline for how we're looking at it, and let's be thoughtful about how we adjust off of it.
So for the first topic we'll go into tonight, we're going to start a little broader with the division, and sadly give some credit to our friends down in East Rutherford and down there around the throughout the New York City, New Jersey region, and talk about some of the improvement. So you've done a metric that's gone through, you had a lot of stuff pre-draft and now mixing in the moves post-draft. I'm going to bring up the chart here. So having, unfortunately, the leaders now, because when you go from Zach Wilson to trading for a two-time, MVP quarterback, that's of course going to carry some weight. Talk a little bit about how you went into evaluating the level of improvement with free agents lost, and then the value of how many draft picks were added and the pieces there to come up with the improvement index here.
Yeah. I guess the first thing I would say, which will maybe hearten Bills fans a little bit or dishearten Jets fans a little bit, is it's not a valuation metric based upon cost and or draft pick cost in the future. This is purely looking at 2023. So, when Aaron Rodgers is coming in with $60 million for 1 year, they're cutting him a check for $60 million for this 1 year, potentially $110 million for 2 years if he stays around. It's a hefty price. It's a hefty price to pay anyone.
Plus
but
he is going
to bring value, and especially is going to bring value over Zach Wilson. So this particular metric, what it does is it says, let's take a snapshot of every roster at the end of the 2022 season and say, let's project them forward into 2023, and then look at all the different changes that we have. Let's reallocate the snap counts based upon what change has been made. Let's reallocate then the value based upon how efficient these players were last year, kind of projecting them out, and then also looking back multiple years for veterans, and then try to figure out how many points are being added here. And to get an idea of what these points mean, it's roughly 30-ish sort of points for one win, which sounds like a lot. But if you just go ahead and do like a simple linear regression on point differential versus like wins over a 500 record, that's basically what it's come down to historically. So even though we're looking at the Jets and we're saying they're 50 points better, it isn't even quite 2 wins over what we would have expected them in the past. And defensively is a little less sticky than offensively. So we'd assume that they'd be a little bit worse, maybe fundamentally defensively, than what they were last season. So that's how they get the big jump. And that's how all these numbers are calculated. Of course, when it comes to the Texans, the Bears, they're coming off of very low baselines for what they were going to do. And they spent money in free agency, and they picked up players in the draft. And that's how they end up being also at the top along with the Jets.
I would assume I remember having this talk with Bills fans in the 2020 season for the Patriots when they went on that crazy spending spree, that, hey, this is going to have long-term implications, but it's also going to make them better this year. Like, overspending on those positions won't matter in the moment. They added talent. Those are talented players. It's going to cost them. And obviously we saw them cutting people and getting rid of people, and it came to fruition pretty quickly. But I think that's a lot where those spending sprees, you look at all the players that the Texans and Bears signed when the baseline was so low, you went from, questionably roster caliber players to now competent NFL starters. You might have overpaid, but adding talent is still adding talent.
Yeah, I think that's it. It's like, what was your baseline versus what you have going forward? So that's a particular thing. And like you mentioned, when you trade up, when you overpay someone and you give them a contract where it has a low value in year one and then it accelerates quickly in the future, all these things are going to look great. Like you never do anything where you give away future picks or future compensation or future cap and get worse because of that. It just doesn't end up happening. And I think it's also an important aspect, and I've had some people point this out when it comes to their particular team, is everyone can look at their team on this and say, we got better in the offseason, because every team gets rid of players who performed poorly. And then you kind of assume the players who performed well will continue to perform well. But we know some of them will, some of them will not. So I think generally also when you look at this in aggregate, it has to equal out to zero. There can't be points gained. When you bring everything net of everyone else, it's going to equal out to zero. So if a team is slightly negative on here or is somewhat even more negative on here, it's not that they didn't get better necessarily in a theoretical sort of standpoint. It's just the other teams have a better chance of getting better, which then subtracts from them when everything gets mixed together as far as the scheduling over the season.
And we all get better by the Chiefs getting worse, right? Am I right?
Yeah.
But in this, with this set of data here, Kevin, I don't know if you have it or not, but my follow-up to this data would be, do you have anything that shows then what the follow-up from, okay, the Jets gained this much, but where are they still in relation to the Bills? Even though the Bills lost this much, the Jets gained this much. Like, how much ground did they actually make up to where you would project the Bills?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're fairly close to what they're being projected in the markets right now, where they're like a top 7-ish sort of team in Super Bowl odds. And I do have the aggregate numbers in this, but even the aggregate numbers in this, it's difficult to fully quantify like what quarterbacks can do because, for instance, the Eagles, they look bad on this chart, but they were the top team going into 2023 because of all the different players that they had, and they lost a lot of great players. And I know, they have players who are ready to fill those roles, but we don't quite know if they're going to be there or not. So I think for the Jets, I believe the hype. And nowadays, it's really difficult to look at almost any team and get an accurate assessment of them, even when we look at Super Bowl odds, which I simulate different things for what's going to happen in the Super Bowl, because there's such a contrast now between the AFC and the NFC that when you point to a team like the Jets and you say, I don't know, they have the 8th highest Super Bowl odds. Well, they're still coming out of the AFC, so they're probably actually a lot better team than that. And then you look over in the NFC, I mean, just try naming like the top 5 quarterbacks in the NFC. It's a pretty difficult exercise. You start scratching your chin a little bit and start thinking about Derek Carr and others. So I think that's also a part of it, is that the Jets are really, really up there as far as one of the great teams. But then there's also the Chiefs, the Bills, the Bengals, the Ravens are right up there with some of the others too, that are just in that sort of mix that would be a clear big part of a top tier within the NFC this year.
Yeah, and the NFC, if you took the Steelers or the Broncos and slid them over to the NFC
Jaguars,
South, you'd be talking. Yeah, the Jaguars are a perfect example. You'd be talking about, oh man, could they meet up with the Eagles in the playoffs? And in the AFC, everyone's like, yeah, somebody's got to finish 10th. It's tough. So now, as we talk about that, and obviously you showed that the Bills relatively they lose the biggest name out of their plus and minus in free agency with Tremaine Edmonds signing for $18 million with Chicago. And the Bills tried to do more like around the edges things, like, oh, we hope that Connor McGovern's an upgrade over Roger Saffold. We hope that Deontay Hardy is an upgrade over Isaiah McKenzie. We hope that, some of these smaller moves are little improvements around the edges. They didn't do any splashes. Were there any signings for the Bills that did register when you were looking through some of the different pieces there that you thought would be a helpful move or something under the radar for Bills fans?
I mean, I think it's more about mitigating the potential costs here. And so the thing that happened with the Bills is we've seen some restructurings that have gone on, but I don't know if you remember, there was a press conference at the end of the season where, there's always this thing going on, and it's like for when Bean was talking after the season about how tough it is when you have these big contracts, everyone jumped all over that versus what the Bengals said. The real problem was actually coming into this season. What was going to end up happening? There was going to be a big bump up in Josh Allen's contract, a big bump up in Stephon Diggs' contract. Von Miller was off of that first contract. So the fact that they were able to mitigate a lot of that is what I think is more important than anything else. You mentioned McGovern coming in. That's definitely one that registered as being a pretty good value. Damian Harris coming in.
I would say Harris for 1.77, Taylor Rapp for 1.77. Those they're not going to be like by themselves game-changing moves, but I was at least happy about those. And the post-draft, I was infatuated with Poona Ford, so I was very excited about that one.
And Sherfield's probably like a plus over your Kumaro.
Jake Kumaro.
Right? Those where they improved over like these, you don't have to have Tywan Jones on the roster anymore.
Yeah, I think it also comes down to when you're building, I like to think of using free agency in certain positions in contrast to what positions you may want in the draft is really helpful. So when we're talking about like a third or a rotational receiver is a good place to go. We mentioned now a running back, interior offensive lineman. Interior offensive lineman is one of the best positions you can get in free agency because they're on the same franchise tag as all offensive linemen are on the same franchise tag, which ends up pricing out a lot of the interior players for teams that don't want to use the franchise tag on them. So these are like good positions to use that you're not going to have to go spend those picks in the draft and just not have as nearly the amount of upside, and then being able to re-sign them potentially on second contracts at a value also.
Can I ask you two questions? I hate to steal you here for a second, but we had this in a Twitter Spaces the other day. We were talking about the value of guards and interior
Yeah.
offensive linemen and how they are undervalued, in my opinion, in the league, especially when we talk about pressure, right? Like, I think the way everybody talks about pressure, all the film guys, is interior pressures, maybe the most significant, maybe the most disruptive, but we don't treat those assets as though they are something that stops the most significant type of pressure. Why is that, in your opinion, that the interior offensive line is so much undervalued to the rest of the offensive line, especially those guard positions?
Well, I mean, I think when you get pressure from the outside versus pressure from the interior, it's more damaging. But it might be underweighting the interior pressure for a way because it's kind of like fuzzy when you don't get a clean something you can necessarily chart
Less
as a
one-on-one,
pressure,
sure.
so that makes it more difficult. But when there is a pressure or there is a sack from the outside, it ends up being more damaging. More often they're fumbles in those circumstances. More often it's deeper drops, maybe for quarterbacks. So maybe that's a little bit of a confounding factor that they're taking a longer sack than they're taking on interior pressure, a step up interior pressure sack there. So that ends up being part of it. I think it's easier to isolate the play of tackles and edge rushers. Like they're some of the easier positions to scout coming out of the college. Well, I mean, edge rushers, at least to scout coming out of college. Maybe not tackles as much, but also when you transfer from team to team, there's less of a like scheme and help and double teams and things like that. I mean, there's some of that. Obviously, you can chip, you can do things like that, but I think that's also part of it. And there's a little bit of like a weak link type of system on the offensive line where you're only as strong as your weakest links. When you have three players who are bunched up in the interior, sometimes if you have a really great player there, they don't get as much value because of the fact that if you have another weak link next to you, if you don't have that, like they have isolated matchups on the outside a little bit more often, but when you have that weaker link inside of you and weak communication, which again, one player cannot communicate for everyone. If you have weak communication on the inside, then it can be more damaging. So it's just like a single player can't necessarily make as much of a predictable impact when they move from one situation to another.
Okay, I like it. That's probably the best answer I've gotten for that topic. So I appreciate that. But let's get back on track here before Greg gets mad at me. So he was asking about the terms of additions. I'm going to give it a little more pinpoint in terms of concerns. I want your overall concerns of free agency, any questions or concerns of guys they added. But specifically, are you surprised in the lack of any type of competition or anything brought into the right tackle position for the Buffalo Bills here this offseason?
I mean, it's hard to get good tackle play. So I think that's probably important. It's something that's been very difficult to acquire in free agency. I know we've had a couple of guys move around this year, but it's one of those situations where if you have good tackle play, you normally just don't let them go. So it's kind of like, I'm trying to think of the correct analogy when it comes to insurance, where it's like moral hazard is what they call it for insurance. So if you offer insurance to people without any sort of like physical exam and things like that, well, the people who sign up for insurance are normally the people who are in the worst health. So it ends up being like more costly than anything else. It's kind of the same thing. It's kind of like this moral hazard when it comes to signing free agents, where the ones who are let go, even if their tape may look pretty good, there might be something else going on as to why another team wouldn't sign them. Because if you have an elite tackle, I think it's something that most teams are able to work around when it comes to spending, because they're also a very long tail career-wise. The offensive lineman can last a really, really, really long time. So yeah, there's that too. And then when it comes to the draft, you kind of have to have almost a top half of the first round pick, at least a first round pick, like end of the first round, maybe. And we saw in this particular draft, there was not a lot of tackle talent. And guys were getting pushed up a little bit. I mean, we had Paris Johnson, obviously that was someone who was highly targeted by the Cardinals, probably went earlier than he should have. And even guys like Skoronski, who people loved a lot, he may end up being even a guard in the NFL versus being a tackle. So I just don't feel like we had a lot in this draft. Hopefully they can piece it together.
You talk about the long-term costs with that Jets trade. They don't even talk about that swap of 13 to 15 in the overall cost. They talk about the future one, but it pretty directly cost them Broderick Jones in being able to drop down there. And of course, Belichick twisting the knife a little bit to let somebody jump up ahead of them.
Yes, I think that's part of it too. And when it comes to Allen, We'll see how he performs this coming season, but at least by my numbers, and I also have something where I look at like time to pressure versus actual sack rates and things like that. He has been someone who's pretty good at avoiding taking sacks even when he takes on pressure. Some of it is because he invites it, but some of it is because they've schemed well to get the ball out of his hands early, and I think he has pretty good feel in the pocket. So maybe you could argue that it's not necessarily as important as some other positions. I know, tackle is always important, so it's not necessarily the case, but maybe he's someone who can help you out a little bit in that department versus someone who doesn't have the escapability when it comes to pressure coming off of the edge.
Yep. So I'm going to set you up here, Kevin. We're going to help you make Bills fans feel good, and then you can let them down gently.
Story of my life.
As we go through and look at the setup for it, first, there's some, kind of exciting parts. You look at the value on the first day. We see Dalton Kincaid's pick up in the upper quadrant here, where you're measuring big value board versus mock draft value, coming out that, hey, he was a player that wasn't expected to be available at the Bills spot and that they got early. And then you add into that even the next pick with going for Osiris Torrance actually topping out on your chart of the top value for the second round of who is there and the expectation of it. So talk a little bit about what you've seen there. And then I joked about letting people down, maybe why that can be a little bit misleading historically of how smart we think that is, or how much that correlates to them actually turning out.
Yeah. So the two different metrics that I'm looking at here is, one is looking at mock draft value by consensus, weighted by the accuracy of the mock drafter in the past and that information. There's a company called Grinding the Mocks, which my friend Benjamin Robson collects everyone's mock drafts and he weights them and everything to figure out where is someone's like weighted average mock draft position. The other one is an aggregate of all these different consensus big boards to try to figure out where a player goes. So I think when you want to look at this is like, it's important not to reach for players more so than it is to say that you've gotten a great value by getting a player who was being projected earlier than some others. So you do get credit. You do get credit for not reaching, and not reaching means, you're getting a player later than you may have expected, or if you're getting them essentially in line with what you would have expected. And when you look at the empirical evidence, though, like the historical evidence on this, you find that players who are drafted earlier than what you expected based upon big boards and others, they underperform their draft position. So there's something to that. And the flip side, though, which is interesting, is if a player is taken after where you're expecting them to go, they don't really overperform their draft expectations. So you're wondering why that is. I think there's a logical reason for that, and that is you only need one team to reach, but you need several teams for a player to fall for them to truly be as much of a steal value as you can have. So I would say the upside for the Bills on these picks is they didn't reach, they get credit for that, but maybe not as wide of a credit. It's not a 1-to-1 sort of ratio if you get a player 10 players later than you expected versus 10 players earlier, being a negative, because that means 9 teams had to be wrong versus just one team has to be wrong to draft them too early.
So, and that leads into here, you can let everyone down a little bit gently. I'm going to pull up the AFC, the draft surplus value. Talk about, we talked pre-show, the Bills had leaned as much, I don't know if it was like the most in the league, but very much on the premium positions. All their early picks had been quarterback, edge, cornerback, edge, like over and over again, leaning or trading a first for a wide receiver, had been on those premium positions. This year, it definitely leaned away from that. We saw the first 3 picks are tight end, guard, linebacker. Then, you get a wide receiver late and then another guard. So leaning much, much further away, talk about how, that's not to say those players won't turn out. You just showed in the other metrics that, there is a pretty good chance they could turn out. But that maybe the benefit of getting them won't be as strong as what it could be if you had gone the other direction, or ideally not reached, but taken another shot, even if it wasn't a need on that day. How do you balance that, where obviously it seems like something that logically would make sense in being able to pick the best player on the board when maybe you should still lean towards those premium positions. How would you balance that if you were a GM?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. I think one thing that it comes down to, and you often hear this as a justification for picks, is, we're following our board, best player available. So, you got to make sure the board is, when it aggregates different positions. And I think scouts and others are excellent when it comes to scouting players within position. It's very intuitive to do something like that. But when it comes to compiling it all together, maybe a little bit more difficult. So I think that's one thing to look at here. And it's really like the NFL itself is telling us certain things. When I'm looking at the positional value for different positions, it's not, my personal opinion. It's not even the different models that I have that gauge on a points basis how valuable these positions are. It's really looking at, hey, what does the NFL pay these players on their second contract for these different types of positions? Traditionally, if you drafted a tackle in the middle of the first round versus a safety in the middle of the first round, how much money are they making on their second contract? You can make tweaks for some positions, like maybe running back, who have a little bit more front-loaded value in that rookie contract. So maybe that isn't the greatest measure for them. But, for safety versus tackle, I don't think you could really necessarily say there's any reason why on a second contract one versus the other. So as the NFL is telling us, in a league where, how everyone wants to say the cap is fake, the reality is you have a certain amount of money to spend over a 10-year horizon. Most teams are going to spend basically the same amount of money. Some of the contracts are fake, but the cap is pretty real for what you have to spend, that you want to make sure that you're allocating your money in a way based upon what we've seen in the past is going to maximize the value, because you have so many different avenues to use. We talked about free agency. We talked about trades. You talk about the draft. You just want to make sure that every trade that you're making, if you can gain a little bit of a value, eventually that turns into an extra player, an extra 2 players, an extra 3 players, which can make the big difference, especially when we're talking about teams that are competing for the highest ranks of the playoffs.
In these types of values, is there a little bit of a game with, I keep coming back to like hybrid type players and the Bills, the conversation around the Bills, where the value traditionally for picking a tight end in the first round may not be there. But if your tight end isn't really a tight end and it's more of a pass catching wide receiver option for you, but they're still limited in the NFL to the tight end contract. We've seen it with tight ends trying to break free from those values that people associate to the position. It becomes a benefit for the team, right?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. I would say for tight end is a really hard one. And I would even hedge here on that was the biggest positional value loss of any of the Bills picks, according to the historical numbers. And we could just be dealing with a small sample size here. I mean, teams have been really, teams have been really bad at rank ordering tight ends in the past. And
all the best ones have not been first rounders, weirdly.
Yeah. So yeah, they're not really going that early. If you think about, the famous like Eric Ebron going before Odell Beckham Jr., or even recently when it's Kyle Pitts going before Jamar Chase in different first round. And then we had 2017, 3 tight ends went in the first round. It was OJ Howard, Evan Ingram, and then David Njoku. And Njoku's been decent, and he's the only one who's still on the same team that he was currently. And even TJ Hawkinson's not on the same team. He's been okay, but I don't think anyone's looking at him and saying that's like an elite type of player that you're getting at that pick that would be equivalent to an elite wide receiver that you could get there.
Yeah, so part of the math doesn't know that those were bad picks. All they're saying is, hey, our data says if you take tight ends in the first round, it hasn't turned out great.
It hasn't turned out great, but I do think there is something difficult about scouting potentially tight ends versus coming to the NFL. Well, let's face it, most colleges, they don't know what they're getting at tight end. Like, these guys are rotating in and out all the time. You could probably assume anyone who's on your team when these 100 different colleges that are at the top here, where if they can block pretty well, they're probably not going to be able to catch pretty well. And if they can do those sorts of things, you're not necessarily going to adjust your scheme based upon what this one particular tight end is going to do, knowing in a year or two he may be gone, and then you're going to have to refigure things back out again. So it's just been really, really tough. I mean, Travis Kelce was a 3rd-round pick. George Kittle was a 5th-round pick. Dallas Goedert has been pretty good. He's a 2nd-round pick. And it's just thin at the top when it comes to elite tight end play also. So that really pushes the value further and further down. So I would say that this draft was a really, really good draft for tight ends. So it's not the value calculation here isn't like Dalton Kincaid doesn't have a really great profile, because he does. He has an excellent profile. It's just maybe we have guys that we wouldn't have expected to be almost as good that were taken a round later or 2 rounds later and so on. So it's just like, how do you manage that? How do you manage that uncertainty versus your draft evaluation? And maybe the first tight end, at least in the past, who people were certain about, hasn't ended up being that guy.
So looking at all the value of these different draft picks for the Bills, on the Bills side, what is your favorite pick from the 2023 Buffalo Bills draft class based on what you've looked at?
Based upon what I've looked at, let me pull it up here. So, I mean, I like Torrance. I like the guard pick there. And if you look at, you wouldn't think that that's necessarily a positional value type of pick, but what you've noticed is for interior offensive linemen, it's almost like it's really compacted more than you think in the first round when it comes to the premium positions as to who you want. And that's what we're talking about, at least by my numbers. It's tackle, it's edge rusher, it's a pass rushing interior defender, like someone who plays on the interior of the defensive line who can really get at the quarterback. It's that. The second tier is more cornerbacks and wide receivers, which that can float a little bit, especially wide receiver can float well into the second round and still be pretty good. Interior offensive linemen who've been great, it's almost like you don't really want them in the first 20, 25 picks. And there's been a huge success rate in the second or third round for those types of picks. So that's definitely by far my favorite, taking him at 59. It's a positive value here, and it's just a good use of capital. It's a very high hit rate in that sort of area.
Mm-hmm.
I like it. Which one stuck out to you as the biggest, for your numbers, the biggest reach? I think I maybe saw it was shorter.
Yeah, I mean, just purely by the numbers, although we are starting to get into the, you're like the 150th pick in the draft.
It gets muddy out there, right?
Yeah, it's one of those things where it ends up being a reach by the numbers, but it's still like Kincaid is the one that still shows up as being the most negative value because of the fact that these tight ends haven't been successful there. There was a trade up, a minor trade up. There was a trade up involved in that, which is generally going to be viewed poorly to go and get him versus, I guess it's just my numbers are not that confident whether Kincaid or Laporta or Mayer or even guys who are going much later than that are necessarily going to be better.
So as we go through that kind of thing and you give Bills fans on the overall thoughts of the offseason, some of this was predicted in that, hey, when we did all the spending the year before and you give Von Miller a $5 million, cap hit, and you have the, still the compressed value on Josh Allen, and you had done so many restructures. What is your kind of final thoughts on this Bills offseason? Like we talked about, those little moves around the edges, the Poona Fords, the Latavius Murrays, the Connor McGoverns, the Deontay Hardys, and then this draft that wasn't necessarily premium positions, even if some of them could turn out. What are your thoughts on what they've done in the offseason, and what would you tell Bills fans of what they should expect?
I mean, there's no reason to expect anything worse than being in a virtual tie for being, the best team in the NFL right now. So I think they've navigated it well. And especially when we talk about the restructures and others they've done with Allen and, being able to figure things out as far as the contract is concerned. And it seems, especially with Allen, like it's weird. He and Mahomes are both very team friendly. It seems like their attitude towards their contracts and what they've ended up doing, which is going to be extremely important. So I know there may have been some negativity here, but it's kind of funny when we look back not only to, last season, but even the season before. I've been very, very high on the Bills versus kind of the ups and downs of what we've seen. And I think the Bills are right there with everyone else. And I know maybe it was a little bit of a disappointing exit last season, but they really are a team that's right there in competition with everyone else. And it's funny because, like on a week by week basis, you want to say everything. I think the Bills, at least by my numbers, were the best team in the NFL until the last few weeks of the season, where it started to favor the Chiefs a little bit. And I don't have any different expectation than that for what's going to happen this year. If anything, I would say I still think they're better than the Bengals, although the Bengals are getting maybe a little bit more hype at this point.
No, I think, obviously some of the things that the Bills had enjoyed very favorable injury luck for a couple of previous years. Then the year where they probably had the most talented roster of my adult life had to be the year that we get the horrible injury luck and everything starts
and every other thing that could happen.
Yeah. And literally like once in a lifetime storms that happen and watching a teammate die on the field and, just totally normal things like that. It's very, very, very standard. Yeah. So before we get you out of here, let the folks know where they can find the Substack and what other things you have coming up.
Yeah. So it's unexpectedpoints.substack.com. Again, going into the season, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the fantasy and the betting angle of things. I actually just put a bet down on the Browns to win the AFC Championship, where I kind of don't really like them that much. 22-1, though. I mean, like it's kind of funny how Deshaun
so unlikable.
I know it's one of those things. Like, I mean, he's probably like MVP odds are actually very, very low for Deshaun Watson. That makes sense to me because I don't think anyone's going to be able to.
That's a narrative
to get themselves to vote.
People are.
I don't think anyone's like his MVP odds are. In the same range as like Jared Goff or someone like that. And that kind of makes sense to me, but I don't know. So I kind of like them. I kind of like the Bills slightly a little bit. It's a little bit harder when they're up near the top. So I'm going to have a lot of that sort of content going on, including futures on players and different props in that area. Yeah. And then when we get into the season, what I do and kind of the majority of what I do is I have these, what I call, like adjusted scores, and people love to, they're like, oh, we got the adjusted win when they didn't actually get the win. It's funny. People get mad at you both ways. If you say their team was good and they didn't win, then they get mad at you. And they really get mad at you if you say they didn't deserve to win and they did win. And then they really, really get mad at you. But I have this thing where I look at every single play by the typical variance that you would see, especially when it comes to turnovers, when it comes to turnover-worthy plays that weren't turnovers, things like that. And I try to come up with a score of what I would have expected to be and project forward my power rankings based upon that. So again, I got a lot of people yelling at me on social media about that, but then I get people subscribing to the newsletter, and the latter is much more important to me. So I'll have all of that content during the season also.
If you figure out how to pay your mortgage and people yelling at you on Twitter, let me know.
If
we can get that going, I'm on board.
Let us know. Absolutely. And I too prefer data that only confirms my biases. So.
I do like it though. When someone writes you and it's like, it's like Chiefs Kingdom 69-420, and they're like, man, you hate the Chiefs. Why are you so biased against the Chiefs? And I'm like, do you think I'm biased against the Chiefs, or do you think you might be biased towards the Chief? Like,
Kevin,
I'm going to go out on a limb here and say it may be you, but
I won't lie. There's probably a good chance that I said something mean in one of your threads back when you were with PFF. I don't feel good about it, but I'm sure that there was a time where I said something that was like, you don't know what you're talking about, PFF guy.
I try to let it go. Fandom, we have to know. It's like temporary insanity charge, like the Twinkie defense. It's like the Twinkie defense except it's the fandom defense when it comes to these things. So I allow all that. My mission is to have all 32 fan bases like quote tweet me with something positive and negative during the course of the season at one point or another, because that honestly,
you hate us and that you love us.
When it comes to the overrated, underrated discussion, I'm willing to flip both ways. Most people think if you say a team is overrated, it means they're bad. And if a team is underrated, they're good. But it's like, no, it means actually where we stand on them at this particular moment. So I'm saying the Bills are underrated slightly.
Yeah, for all the things that are out there.
I will flip on you guys if you go like 5-0 to start the season. Just
it's going to ruin it, because right now I love so Emmanuel Acho putting out there today that the Bills aren't even in the top 5 in the AFC, and that all the frauds we've seen, they can't make it. It's great.
The bulletin board just
all the chips on all the shoulders. Sean McDermott bathes in it. Like this is his.
Do you guys have like a cable Thanos guy that can do the videos for the Bills of aggregating everyone? You know what I'm talking about? There's a Seahawks guy who would put together those videos. Is there a Bills guy who also does that?
There will be.
That's a market. So for everybody listening listening right now, that is a market right there. Make the bulletin board material reels each week. That's a great market.
Yeah.
All right, Kevin. Thank you very much for your time. You're very generous
Really
with us tonight.
appreciate
We
it, man.
appreciate it. This is fantastic. Everybody, you can find Kevin's work down in the show description here. Like I said, I am not only a fan, I am a subscriber myself. I enjoy the podcast. I enjoy the Substack. It's very worthwhile. So make sure you check it out. Thanks for your time. And now we'll let Kevin go.
All right.
Thanks,
Kevin.
Kevin.
Appreciate you. So obviously, it's always fun if people tell us nice things about the Bills. That's my favorite. But I thought it was interesting to look at because we talked.
I think
a
he
little bit
pumped some breaks.
Yeah, like some of the things. It's when we were talking about things like pass rush, defensive tackle, offensive tackle, we were leaning wide receiver, some of the more premium positions.
Yeah.
So at first glance, when they opened up, tight end, guard, linebacker, that's not necessarily like where most of the math tells you, hey, you should lean. I can talk myself into it. It makes sense where they're going to go. But I think that having people like Kevin share that, hey, it doesn't mean it's not going to work out. And he actually, I meant to follow up on one of the things. We were already going kind of long. He talked a little bit in one of the shows about how the historical sample size for first round tight ends is rough, but the hit rate, if you do hit on a tight end,
super great, right?
It's actually the second highest value outside of quarterback, because there's this weird suppression of the market where guys like Kelsey and Kittle and Andrews are paid like 60% of what wide receivers are paid. So if you do hit, you get a huge value, so that it's almost worth swinging at them, even if historically there's been a lot of Eric Ebrons and a lot of those guys who weren't big hits in the first round. If you do hit on it, it's a huge value.
Yeah, if you get a Greg Olsen, you're fantastic. And that was I was trying to make that sort of point. I think I worded it incorrectly of like, I understand where his value charts are, but I do think that the data is cool. And I think that is good information to have, and it should be weighted into how you view these things, but it does lack context. And does lack a lot. And I think he would admit that if we had more time to really parse that out and talk about that, in that when you really then refine this data and look at this particular prospect, Dalton Kincaid, and the Buffalo Bills and what they gave up to get there, I don't think that value adds up with where his chart is for me.
Correct.
Because of where we see that usage. And go watch Eric's video that he just did on his projected usage. And I think that shows me that value going up.
Yeah. And I will say, for the 3 people listening right now who are actually going to go subscribe and listen to Kevin's Substack and his podcast, he does go into pretty good detail on that. His system is very agnostic. It is like he purposely says, hey, if you get, he does a whole rant on making fun of draft grades, where he says draft grades are just saying, did the people agree with you? Like, if they agreed with you and took guys where you valued them, you grade them high. If they didn't pick guys where you agreed with them, you grade them low. Well, this doesn't tell us anything. That's just entertainment. That doesn't actually measure anything. Right. So his approach to it is that, hey, we know historically the draft is a crapshoot, so I'm purely going to measure it on the things we do know, like positional value, like reaches versus steals. And there is a
there's
value
no way to
that,
quantify where a guy gets selected and the offense they're running. So you can't muddy it with anything.
But like he talked about there, that, hey, I know this has come off kind of negative. I still think the Bills are the best team in the NFL, and I still think they're underrated and a great overall team. I think that speaks to the fact that, like, hey, even if it wasn't exactly what I agree with in the route there, they're still really good. Like,
it's all on a spectrum of like where the starting line is, right? Correct, and I think that's important with all that data. Even, the Jets made that big leap, and we were kind of trying to talk that through too, where the Jets made the big leap in terms of how many points they added, the expected points added. But where's the starting line? For everybody?
He said, they might have added like not even quite 2 wins. So maybe by his metrics, he said his metrics show
they made a big jump.
They may have gone from 7-10 to 9-8. Is what his metrics show, is that, hey, they were the biggest improvement in the league, which means they'd improve by 2 wins.
Yes. And so I think it's, this whole offseason, as we prepare to really dig into re-looking at our team and going through each roster and all the positions and all the stuff that we're about to do here as we get ready to ramp up, I do think it's important to still remind and ground the fan base in the reality that like where we're starting from isn't where it's been in the past. Like it's still in the top 5 of the NFL where it started from. To like you've said and everyone said, like clean up those edges. It might not show up in the data as big levels of improvement, but when you already have a really nice house and you just have to add some like ornamental stuff to it, you don't have to fix the foundation.
Yeah, it's a good way to look at it. And I know that, we're about now getting into this part of the offseason where a lot of the big news is slowing down, where now people are reporting things like rookies signing their contracts and schedule leaks like it's news. It's just not. It's just not. Every single rookie is going to sign. We're all going to know the schedule at this time tomorrow. All those things are coming out, and that it's going to be fairly slow.
Yeah.
From a cover one standpoint, we are going to have one more show next week. Still looking at the draft. Our guy Danny Kelly, who is one of my favorite draft guys and one of the co-hosts. You guys have seen Danny Heifetz on my Greg Tompsett Sports Show. His co-host Danny Kelly, that does the draft show with Ben Solak and the fantasy show with Danny, is going to be able to talk through with us. I love the Ringers draft guide, and Danny always has some very entertaining comps, and some of our players apply for that. So we're going to bring up some of those comps that he's had, talk through some of the draft class. That'll be our last show, kind of looking back at the overall offseason and draft. And then we're going to get into our position breakdowns, which is always a fun way to really dive into what do we have for this team for 2023 season.
Yeah, it is fun to look back. We really, one, you've done a nice job setting up a nice schedule for us here this offseason, because it does put a nice bow on it, being able to kind of really wrap this all up individually with some good non-biased, non-homery fans to confirm our biases. And then we get to move forward again and really pick this roster apart before we get to go look at them in person. Hopefully, again, like last year, it will be in person with you and doing some training camp here this summer. It'd be nice to see you again.
That's right. So we're very excited. Make sure, I know Aaron hinted at it a couple times earlier today. The video that Eric and Anthony did talking about the opportunity, some of the breakdown. You did a really cool graphic for the evolution of the position. I was a big fan of that one. So really, really good content. Make sure you're checking that out. A lot of really good stuff going on. And again, as we're getting ready for this offseason breakdown, make sure you guys are checking out what we have going on with the Cover One Pass. We work so hard to be able to give you guys all the content and everything we do. This is how we do it. You guys help support the access that we have to be able to put together those videos, to be able to research what we do, to be able to put together and pull all the data that we can together to make this content for you, make these shows for you. This is the best way to support us. And when you do it, you get a really cool t-shirt and decal, a letter from Eric and Aaron and I, and access to the Cover One Slack channel, which is one of my favorite things. And I know one of yours as well, Aaron.
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. The Slack channel alone is worth joining the membership here. And you want to get in now, because I'm sure that this price is going to go up, because it's not for Super Bowl 57 anymore. So even if it just goes up a bit, you're getting a deal on Cover One Pass if you get in on this now. But honestly, it is a really cool community. It's always active. Sometimes, like, I spend probably way too much time on Twitter, Greg, and I think that you have professed to this as well. But sometimes Twitter's not that active and there's nothing new, and I'll scroll around. But the Slack channel, if you put something out there, it is just like throwing chum in the water. Like, it is, if you need somebody to talk to Bills about, there's always some engagement, some conversation going on all throughout the day. You can hop in. So that alone worth it to me, just to be in this community.
Love it. Love it. So thank you guys for all of your help and support. This is obviously a huge part of what we do, and everything that you can. Make sure you're checking out all the shows. I know tomorrow night, Thomas DeLaus is having a fun schedule release show on Late Night Buffalo. I will be back with a draft on Friday night. We're going to be having some different experts on that are going to be drafting their favorite draft classes, to be able to talk about some of the classes that they think help their team the most, in a fun way to kind of fight through some of that. And then we'll be getting into all the other content you guys have available for it. So make sure you're checking it out. big thank you to our producer, Chris Kepner. Any final thoughts for the people? Aaron?
I do have one final thought, actually. And speaking of Chris, we are going to be actually tomorrow. I just tweeted it out. We usually do our spaces on Friday mornings at 9:30. We're actually going to do it tomorrow morning because I have a doctor's appointment. I'm an adult now, and I have regular yearly appointments that sneak up on me. Forgot about it. So we're switching to Thursday, 9:30. If you haven't checked out the spaces yet, if you're not somebody that's super active on Twitter, it is a lot of fun. And if you've ever wanted to really engage with us and the Cover One crew, it's been really great. We've had a lot of people that I recognize from the chat, a lot of supporters that I see on Twitter. It's really cool when we get to engage with everybody, and some familiar face. Bill's Reddit comes on there, Joe DeRosa, Thomas DeLaus, like you just said. A lot of the Cover One people are on there every week. We're having a lot of fun with it. So if you haven't checked it out, there's past shows are on YouTube, but try to pop in here tomorrow morning and just listen or join. It's a lot of fun.
Also, make sure you guys are going in there. It's a ton of fun. Be able to, give all your takes and give all your thoughts to the team and listen to all their thoughts live as they go. So, a ton of fun there. Make sure you're checking out everything else on the Cover One channel. Check out Chris Chouse on our fantasy channel. There's a bunch of really good stuff going on there, getting you ready for your dynasty drafts and your fantasy drafts this offseason. It's something that I think you can really do to help support us. But on behalf of Chris Kepner and Aaron Quinn, I am Greg Tompsett. You've been listening to Cover One Buffalo, and we are out.